We were in Rome back in August, and went to the Vatican, and made the long snaking route through the museum to the Sistine Chapel. So we're looking up at the ceiling, and I'm listening to the audio guide. This is God separating light from darkness, and this is God creating the sun and the moon. Creating the sun and the moon. And then I'm looking around at the rest of the ceiling, thinking, that's right. Michelangelo was supposed to be gay. In fact, he's really gay. In fact, I don't know if you've been to the Vatican Museum, but it's basically some rooms by Raphael, the Sistine Chapel, and then acres of naked classical sculpture. And I'm like, yeah, those classicals, they were kind of gay too. And you know, the one actually inspired the other. The Pope started the cult of digging up statuary from antiquity, and basically began art collecting in its modern sense. And it was this cult for all things classical that fueled the Renaissance obsession with the human body. So I'm thinking, if the elite of Greece and Rome were gay, and Michelangelo was gay, then where were all the gay men in the intervening 1200 years? I mean, where did all the gay men go when the classical world collapsed? So this essay is only going to make sense if you believe that people are genetically born gay. If you don't believe in the gay gene, but instead think that homosexuality is sinful behavior brought on by bad upbringing, then you're probably going to think this is all a bunch of nonsense. My personal theory is that a tendency to homosexuality began appearing in the new urban societies of the Mediterranean in the first millennium BC. It may possibly have been a response to the no longer pressing need for population growth, since these city-states were already densely populated. I thought that this was a really neat theory, but then I found out that Aristotle had postulated something pretty much the same. Now, the important thing to remember about Hellenic civilization is not that they created the foundations of Western civilization and literature, theater, philosophy. They figured out that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and that if you made a column a little bit fat in the middle, it looked like it was straight from far away. And that they did all this, and oh, they happened to be gay. No, they did this because they were gay. The Greek miracle was produced by 45,000 men over 6 generations in a handful of city-states. And how did it happen? Pederasty. Sexual relations between man and adolescent. These men, however, weren't just having sexual relations with these lads, they were also teaching them all of the inherited wisdom and knowledge from ancient civilization, at a time before formal education. I don't want to say anything too inflammatory, but classical civilization, that of the Greeks and the Romans, was essentially a highly cultured gay elite supported on a superstructure of millions of enslaved heterosexuals, whose job was to produce and reproduce. And for its first 2 centuries, Christianity was in large part a liberation theology for heterosexual slaves. Now, the question I asked at the beginning seems rather pertinent because right now the Vatican is grappling with the problem of homosexual priests. And let me stress, before I begin, that my agenda is not pro or anti-gay, nor is it pro or anti-Catholic. My only agenda is to determine what happened and to understand it for its full complexity. In 2005, the Vatican issued a new set of guidelines for seminarians studying to be priests. The Catechism distinguishes between homosexual acts and homosexual tendencies. While profoundly respecting the persons in question, cannot admit to the seminary or to holy orders those who practice homosexuality, present deep-seated homosexual tendencies, or support the so-called gay culture. Different, however, would be the case in which one were dealing with homosexual tendencies that were only the expression of a transitory problem, for example, that of an adolescence not yet superseded. Nevertheless, such tendencies must be clearly overcome at least 3 years before ordination to the diaconate. Well, I've got news for the Vatican. I call it the Michelangelo Code. And you know what? The code is this simple. Or perhaps I ought better to rephrase that. As an answer to the question I asked earlier about where all the gay men went when the classical world collapsed, well, I believe they hid in the clergy of the Catholic Church. In order to explain my theory, I've made this chart. If you're going to be a priest, you can be straight and chaste, straight and unchaste, gay and chaste, and gay and unchaste. Now, the ideal candidates are over here. Problem is that these guys very often end up over here and leave the priesthood. Such is the case with Father Al, who taught us church history in sophomore year. He ran off with our English teacher, Ms. W., who he later married as his wife. Or my Uncle Ronnie, who spent 7 years as a monk in a Trappist monastery speaking to nobody. Then he decided to take a little break from the cloistered life, met an ex-nun named Betty, and moved to Denver and became a flaming atheist, then a Unitarian Universalist, then a Shackley salesman, then an Armenian Orthodox. He liked the chanting. My theory is that through much of its history, the clergy of the Catholic Church has been stocked largely from over here. The concept of celibacy having a kind of holiness dates from before Christianity, and I do not propose that this was originally a conscious conspiracy on the part of late classical gay elite. Rather, it would be one of history's great unintended consequences. A regime of celibacy, generation after generation, succeeds in recruiting young men who consider a life without female copulation perfectly enjoyable, and once they reach the seminary or the monastery, only then do they realize their attraction to men. This does not mean that there were not also millions of those who were in these categories. But I believe that time and again the institutions of the church would fall under the sway of this kind of clergy. This does not mean that I am saying that because these men were gay, they were not also holy. I'm not saying that they didn't generously care for the laity and give them comfort in their lives. And most importantly, I am not saying that these men did not provide the people with what to them was the most accurate description of divinity possible. All I'm saying is that I think that a majority of them were gay, whether here or here. And it does not mean that many of them were not here precisely because they saw their homosexuality as sinful, and at great effort and will resisted that sin. I call my theory the Michelangelo Code because it is Michelangelo who outs the clergy. He's doing so because he represents a new model for gay men. He shows them a new route. They no longer have to be priests. They can be, get this, artists. Michelangelo was part of a large migration of Florentine masters brought to the court of the Vatican. Another thing they brought with them was a secular gay lifestyle. From the 14th century on, Florence had been a center for the arts, painting, sculpture, architecture, as well as the applied arts, goldsmiths, gilders, framers, printers, jewelers, and cabinet makers, all of them organized on the guild method with large numbers of artistically oriented young apprentices and journeymen inhabiting close quarters. And, surprise, surprise, you had a serious outbreak of gay culture. Situation was so bad in the 1430s that the city opened free brothels with women prostitutes, to try to counteract the persistent plague of sodomites. Here's how I read what Michelangelo is saying. This, to me, is pederasty. Older man passing love and knowledge to the younger man. This describes the origin of classical civilization. Eve here represents the burdens of heterosexual lifestyle, child-rearing, food-producing. Here is Noah preparing a sacrifice. This is the old Hellenistic religious milieu. The flood, the destruction of the classical world, and gay men are fleeing to the ark of the Catholic Church. And here we have the drunkenness of Noah. His sons mock him because he is naked and drunk. The liberties of antiquity are at an end, and we are under the new asceticism of the Christian regime. I focus on the 16th century because it is one of those moments when the lid pops off history and you get a chance to see events from multiple angles. Interesting to note, 1510, same time that Michelangelo is painting the Sistine Chapel. Who else is in Rome? Martin Luther. Luther was an Augustinian monk sent to Rome on official business. He was to negotiate with the future head of the order in Rome regarding disputes between the German branch of the Augustinians and the Roman headquarters. The man he met there was Giles of Viterbo. This humanist scholar also advised on the ideological layout of the Sistine Chapel. He probably proudly showed off the creation to Luther. But what might have caught Luther's attention were these guys. So here's my second bombastic statement of the evening. I think one of the reasons Martin Luther split from the Catholic Church was because he saw the clergy as superfluous and gay. You see, all the major heresies from the 11th century on attack in some way the privilege of the celibate/homosexual priest class. The Cathars, the Albigensians, the Lollards, the Hussites, the Waldensians, and finally the Reformation itself. In each case, the heresy posits the idea that there be no formal priest class, but rather married heterosexual preachers coming from the laity. Martin Luther was simply thinking, "Thank you very much, you gay celibate priests, but we straight Germans can read our own Bible and practice Christianity for ourselves." And in that way he was following a line of thought developed by Jan Hus and the Hussites in Bohemia. And Jan Hus was getting many of his ideas from John Wycliffe, a 14th century English theologian who shared Luther's contempt for the elitist religious orders and promoted reading the Bible in the vernacular. He made the first translation into English. His followers were lay preachers who often couldn't read Latin and were called Lollards. In 1395 the movement represented a growing challenge to papal authority in England, and in that year they presented their 12 conclusions of the Lollards to the English Parliament. Now this is their third conclusion on clerical celibacy. Third conclusion, sorrowful to hear, is that the law of continence, that is, celibacy, annexed to priesthood, that in prejudice of women was first ordained, induces sodomy in Holy Church. They're saying it in plain words. The Lollards knew it in 1395. I believe Martin Luther knew it. I definitely think John Calvin knew it when he wrote in Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book 4, Chapter 12, Section 23, of the celibacy of priests. In one thing they are more than rigid and inexorable in not permitting priests to marry. Trusting to their vile celibacy, they have become callous to all kinds of iniquity. The prohibition, however, clearly shows how pestiferous all traditions are, since this one has not only deprived the Church of fit and honest pastors, but has introduced a fearful sink of iniquity, and plunged many souls into the gulf of despair. To me, it is clear that Calvin refers to the sin that shall not be named. So what was the papacy like in the Renaissance? Well, according to Noel I. Gard, in Jonathan to Gede, the Homosexual in History, the following Renaissance popes were gay: Paul II, Sixtus IV, Alexander VI, Julius II, Leo X, and Julius III. Oh, and if you think that the non-gay clergy didn't know what was going on, then consider Adrian VI, the short-lived exception ruling less than a year. He, like the current pope, was Northern Germanic, grew up in Utrecht. He knew exactly what he was up against. He cancelled most of the artistic projects of the period and spat out a burst of profanity upon looking at Leo X's beloved Roman masterpiece, Laocoon. He would not celebrate Mass in the Sistine Chapel because it was a bathhouse full of nudes. Well, he lasted only 1 year before he was either poisoned or succumbed to the Roman malaria. The subsequent pope, Clement VII, was more of the previous vein, interested in secular pursuits and artistic production. The goldsmith Cellini tells us that Clement had a confidant, Cavaliero, who, though no more than a simple horse-groom, had served faithfully, and the Pope had embraced him, enriched him, and confided in him as oneself. Or more bluntly, in 1527, a street preacher named Brandano interrupted Clement during the Holy Thursday blessing from the balcony of St. Peter's, shouting, "Bastard, sodomite, because of your sins Rome shall be destroyed." And, well, in fact, Rome would very nearly be destroyed later that year when Lutheran German mercenaries in the Emperor's army sacked the city and killed nearly half its inhabitants, plundered its artworks, smashed its relics, and defiled its churches. It brought an end to the glorious milieu of 16th-century Rome. The school of Raphael dispersed or killed. Michelangelo fled back to Florence. I bring up this period of the early 16th century because it shares so much with our own. For the first time since Adrian VI, the short-lived reformer, we have again a German pope, Benedict XVI, and also one who intends to de-gayify the clergy. Now, any attempt to study gay men in the clergy from a historical perspective obviously involves the very subjective tool of archaeological gaydar, and the problem is no less complicated by the fact that few of these men left us written records of their feelings on the subject of their sexual orientation or activity. About the best we can do, very accurately, is consider our present and the very recent past. If the Vatican's own inquiry into the state of seminaries wasn't enough of an alarm bell, I turn to the recent year 2000 publication by Father Donald Cozens, The Changing Face of the Priesthood. Cozens argues that American seminaries were attracting larger and larger numbers of gay students, and that should our seminaries become significantly gay, and many seasoned observers find them to be precisely that, the priesthood of the 21st century will likely be perceived as a predominantly gay profession. I agree with Father Cozens' assessment of the present, but I think he's mistaken in thinking this is a new phenomenon. I believe it's always been this way, since the 4th century. Now there are some interesting studies that give us insight into the recent past as well. In 1966, the School of Nursing of the St. Vincent's Hospital in New York performed psychological tests on candidates for the priesthood and found that perhaps the most troublesome and most frequent appearing sociopathic features or disturbances in assessment work concern the high incidence of effeminacy, heterosexual retardation, psychosexual immaturity, deviations or potential deviations of the homosexual type. A recent study of 107 male candidates, for example, show that 8% of these were sexually deviant, whereas 70% were described as psychosexually immature, exhibiting traits of heterosexual retardation, confusion concerning sexual role, fear of sexuality, effeminacy, and potential homosexual dispositions. According to the way I read those findings, that's 78%. I also refer to research by an ex-priest, Michael Maher, who does a study of rules governing seminarians at the St. Louis Catholic Seminary in the 1950s. They contained all kinds of anachronistic curiosities. For example, particular friendships were banned. Seminarians were never allowed to see each other nude, not even in the showers. Seminarians were not allowed to visit one another in each other's rooms except with special permission. The door had to stay open, and they were never allowed to sit on one another's bed. In comparison, the nearby, equally all-male, Lutheran Concordia Seminary had none of these rules. Interestingly, Maher interviews a more recent graduate of St. Louis Seminary, Father Bob, who attended in the 1980s, when most of these rules no longer existed and homosexual activity among the students was widespread. In fact, a rule prohibiting something is sometimes a historian's best indication of a social trend. Saint Benedict wrote in his Rule in the 6th century that all monks are to sleep in separate beds. If possible, they should sleep in one room. Let a candle burn throughout the night. They will sleep in their robes. He also forbid close friendships among the brothers. Let me stress that in my research, I've been most often assisted by the writings and web pages of conservative, traditionalist Catholics. I've also been expecting sooner or later that Dan Brown moment when someone says that I've stolen their idea. If I believe there's a person who's already close to my own conclusions, it's Randy Engel, author of the self-published Rite of Sodomy, Homosexuality and the Roman Catholic Church. In the book, she describes the recurring infestation of homosexuality within the Church and the unwillingness of the hierarchy to do much about it. And it was she who alerted me to the single best source of all, which is St. Peter Damian, who, in the 11th century, wrote a long letter to Pope Leo IX called the Book of Gomorrah, describing the widespread infestation of homosexuality among the clergy. He described in great detail the variants of the vice with precise categorization from masturbation to sodomy. He especially fiercely denounces those bishops who commit these absolutely damnable acts with their spiritual sons. Who can expect the flock to prosper when its shepherd has sunk so deep into the bowels of the devil? Who will make a mistress of a cleric or a woman of a man? Who, by his lust, will consign a son whom he spiritually begotten for God to slavery under the iron law of satanic tyranny? Curiously, here was Leo IX's response. In light of divine mercy, the Holy Father commands, without contradiction, that those who, of their own free will, have practiced solitary or mutual masturbation, or defiled themselves by interfemoral coitus, but who have not done so for any length of time, nor with many others, shall retain their status, after having curbed their desires and atoned for their infamous deeds with proper repentance. Peter Damian's work caused significant outrage among the church hierarchy, and eventually Damian had to protest again to the Pope that nothing had been done about the scandal. Often, the reason I am finding my best information from conservative traditionalist web pages is because, like Mrs. Engel, they frantically are trying to expose homosexuality among the clergy and are frustrated because little is done to punish the sinners. For example, Roman Catholic faithful posted full screenshots from the St. Sebastian's Angels webpage, a chat room for gay priests. I added the black bars. And then they were appalled that the priests they had caught red-handed continued to hold their positions. Finally, a Father Robert Hoatzin wrote a long letter to the Renew America website. This website belongs to the right-wing pundit Alan Keyes. And here's what Father Hoatzin says. This is what happens in a celibate-challenged culture. Those who are living the vows are anathema, while the sexual actors are promoted to higher offices. Sex is open, available, and even recommended in many clerical circles today. Priests couple off now and live married sexual lives in vacation houses they purchase together, or in rectories they share together. He goes on to say, why do bishops look the other way, deny and cover up for sexual activities of priests? The answer is simple. They are violators of celibacy themselves, and very often they have reached their positions because they slept around or compromised their promise to live a celibate life. Violators recommend other violators for positions of leadership, and less than honest men and women join the hierarchy and further taint the organization. So if this is our image of the present and the recent past, then the only thing I'm really adding in my theory is the notion that this is not a new phenomenon. It's been this way for 17 centuries. The straight guys have been fighting a losing battle with the gay guys for control of the church. St. Peter Damian describes a similar situation in the 11th century. Why should we assume that the intervening centuries were different? I do stress this is a theory. It's a hunch. But I can tell you that the more I look at the question, it is so obvious to me. Right about now, Benedict should be receiving the results from his investigations of American seminaries that was begun in 2005. We have heard nothing of the results from the inquiry, but my own suspicion is that I think His Holiness and I are in some ways on the same page on this subject. He realizes that if you take the gay priests out of the church, you may not have much of a church left.